Good morning. I'm Shauna Riley from Northern Kentucky University, representing the Northern Kentucky Forum. Thanks for joining us this morning for a cafe where we are unpacking the 2024 Kentucky legislative session. I'm joined today with Representative Steve Doan of District 69, which represents Boone and Kenton County, and Representative Rachel Roberts from District 67, who represents Campbell County. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So it was an exciting session. Budget sessions are always fun. Maybe that's an interesting way of putting it, but it's an interesting session. So what are some of the highlights for you for this last session? What did you get to work on? What do you hope comes back in the next session or doesn't come back in the next session, as it may be?
Sure.
Ladies first.
You know, the budget is always an exciting period of time, and I'll tell you that I think, and I won't speak for both of us, but I'll say, you know, for every legislator this year, this is probably the best budget we're ever going to get to work on because of the surplus that is there for Kentuckians. I hope I'm wrong about that. I hope that the economy continues to grow in such a way that we have this problem of how to spend the money for years, for many years, but we've had to deal with really austere budgets in all of the other budget cycles that I've been through. So it was exciting to be able to try and spend the money in a way that will have lasting impact and really generational change for the state of Kentucky. And I'm certain there'll be some disagreements about whether we really accomplish that and whether we accomplish it in the right areas. But I'll tell you, that was probably the most exciting part for me.
The most exciting part for me, I think, was House Bill 102. It's something that I filed. It was met with great disdain if you're a local government official, because what it did ultimately was it took away your ability to regulate residential zoning. But if you were a national housing expert, you absolutely loved the bill. And so it's gotten a lot of national attention, hoping that during the interim we can work on it some more, build some more support behind it, and hopefully get that through in the next session.
So speaking of the budget, you know, as a college professor, we love supports for education. So we saw a lot of discussion about education and particularly funding. So thank you. But in that vein, there was a lot of discussion about what's going on in the P through 12 era, even in post-secondary education. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the legislative wins and challenges when it comes to education this season, this session. It's not a season.
Yeah. So on education, for me, I mean, a big win was being able to get a constitutional amendment up for school choice. I think that's a critical issue. It's something that we do need the voters to decide on what that looks like. It'll be interesting, assuming that passes in the next legislative session. Basically, what we did with that language is we delayed any real fight over what school choice looks like in Kentucky over to that next legislative session. I was a little bit disappointed that we didn't do anything on the DEI issues in higher education. There were 2 bills filed. There was a whole session. They were priority bills in both the House and the Senate, 6 and 9, 6 over in the Senate, 9 in the House. And just what happened was the Senate just let something die on the vine. Whether you agree with the issue from a policy perspective or not, it's something that I think we should have addressed. We should have looked at from we just wasted time during the session. We didn't actually dig into the issue. And so that's something that I think next session we'll look at, hopefully doing something there as well.
So I'll say my biggest disappointment when it came to education this year is that we didn't use the surplus that we have to, and the budget that we have, to be able to put dedicated raises in for our educators. Twice now we've raised SEEK funding and expected that SEEK funding to trickle down to the educator level, and it just doesn't across the board when that happens because schools have too many other costs and needs that they have to meet with those funds. And even with raising SEEK again, we're still below, you know, levels when adjusted for inflation. So that was one of my biggest disappointments. I'm also disappointed that we didn't fund full day pre-K, and you know, you phrased the question as P through 12, but I'll say, you know, education we know starts at early childhood, and we have a complete desert in many parts of the state for child care, and we really didn't attack that issue. You know, I think some of the biggest issues we had this year, and Representative Doan touched on one, affordable, attainable, income-aligned housing is a huge issue. Child care is a massive issue, and both of these issues are greatly affecting our economy right now and our ability to attract workers to the area. So those are some areas for education that I was concerned about, and then more broadly, to your point of things that we may have wasted time on in this session, we didn't get to some of the real meat and potatoes that Kentuckians need. Now, you and I disagree vehemently on the Amendment 2. I expect that it will fail, much like the last Amendment 2 did. But to your point, you know, we'll put it to the voters, and the voters will have their chance to speak on it. So yeah, I think that's probably a good start.
It's interesting. So a lot of the legislation, particularly the DEI legislation, has gained a lot of attention nationally. And so it wasn't really a surprise to see that here in Kentucky this year. But again, sort of not seeing any movement, regardless of how that may be, and maybe that's what people wanted, is interesting. I think you touched on that, and I think that's a...
Well, one of the things about it, so I had filed Bill. Now, we were talking earlier, Rachel, and I can't remember all your own numbers. I think it was 247 or anyway, there's a number. But what my bill would have done is it would have merged the Council on Post-Secondary Education with KIA, the Kentucky Higher Education Assistance Authority. And so what you have is you have two post-secondary institutions that are kind of occupying the same space. CPE decides what curriculums ought to be, and KIA decides what tuition rates ought to be. And so what my bill would have done is it would have consolidated those two into one unit. The idea behind that is now we're going to find some cost savings here so we can pass those lower tuition rates on to students, and two, align what those entities are doing. If you're going to set curriculum, let's also look at tuition rates at the same time so that we're funding appropriate programs and we have the right degrees. And so it's something, I think, going forward, whether or not that ultimately becomes the idea that we go through, I think that we're going to look at how do we credential, how do we allow for additional doctorate degrees, additional degrees within our universities. And so it is something that we need to rein in. We need to rein in the cost of higher education, whether that comes from additional state or federal funding, or cutting things that students aren't doing, or finding efficiencies and getting rid of some of that bureaucracy in it.
And I'll say, every year, especially election years, there are what I call shiny penny bills, right? These are bills that are meant to grab attention and divert conversations. And in many ways, I feel like the DEI conversation was that. One of the most toxic phrases in Frankfurt is unforeseen consequences. And I think what happened with the DEI bills is people started to actually see the unforeseen consequences of this, what the ramifications would be for scholarships for students, for funding for our universities, for Kentucky basketball, for instance. And then once those consequences were sort of brought to light, I think the bill stalled, and I think that was the right thing for this bill.
Another major, I guess we should start with that there were 1,200 bills, I think, that were introduced.
Yeah,
this
1,220 according to my notes here. Yeah.
So understandably that keeping track of all the numbers is a challenge. But one of the things that we've seen nationally that we didn't see necessarily here in Kentucky was a bill regarding abortion. Now, partly that's because of the previous session and the constitutional amendment, but I wonder if, particularly given the presidential election and our recent gubernatorial election, if there was some hesitation to touch this issue, or we're good, Kentucky has a decision, we're moving forward. I wonder if you all could weigh in on sort of.
I'll start. This is an issue that I care very passionately about, that I have spoken about, that I've told my personal story on the House floor about. There were some conversations about exceptions bills this year. And I think those conversations were understandable given Amendment 2's failure and how loudly the people of Kentucky spoke. But I'll tell you that historically, and what we've seen across the nation, is that the exceptions bills do not work. They are sort of a token that is given to voters who have voted down these very restrictive abortion bans to say, oh, look, we're sensible, we're moderate about this. But they're written in such a way that no one can actually access the care, and then we re-victimize victims by making them out themselves and then perhaps have to go through further scrutiny because they tell their stories. So I don't think that bill was the right bill. I don't think it went anywhere near far enough to actually help Kentuckians. My hope, although I'm not Pollyannish about this, is that we will start, that the General Assembly will start to listen to the voice of Kentuckians who have said, this is too far, we have gone too far, and to see what's happening across the country. I think this is going to be perhaps the quintessential issue for voters this year, so I think even though we don't necessarily have this as literally on the ballot again this year, I think it will be what decides a lot of voters the way that they vote this year.
And I think you're probably not going to see, as long as you have a Republican supermajority of 80, I just don't think you're going to start to see any movement on that issue over in the House. There was an exceptions bill filed. when you're in some of those internal conversations on our side hearing about it, it's a very interesting place because just about every Republican that's run has sworn on that line of the Right to Life survey saying that you're absolutely no exceptions. And when you get in that caucus room, some of those folks break. Some of those folks are for exceptions. And so it'll just be an interesting thing to see going forward. If it is a serious election issue and we're going to lose Republican members over it, you're going to see that maybe in this next election cycle. I don't know that it is, but Kentucky got here on this issue. The Republican supermajority certainly got there on that issue, and so time will tell on what we do with that in the future.
It is interesting too, to Representative Doan's point. Kentuckians voted down Amendment 2, but still elected the members who put the bans in place. And it's an interesting disconnect for voters where they'll say, oh, I don't like what the supermajority has done, but my rep's a good guy or a good gal, even though they're voting against them on that issue. And it's sort of the, I can see them at the grocery store phenomenon of electeds. And I say all the time to people who are voting, take this so seriously, right? When you elect someone, when you go to the ballot box, you are hiring someone for a job. And for most of us, you're hiring someone for a job that if it was in your workplace, you'd never have input on, right? Like you're not going to hire your CEO or your chief financial officer for the state. So take it very seriously and vote for the person, not the party. Vote for the person who is most qualified to do that job for you, your family, and your community.
Just real quick, in terms of voter motivation, on the Democrat side, it's the number 1 or 2 issue that gets people out, is the pro-life or the pro-abortion issues. On the Republican side, it's about 6th. So there's a lot of different issues ahead of that folks turn out on the Republican side to vote for. And it's not that Republicans aren't pro-life, it's that they're looking at other things. And probably because they've seen a large victory with Roe being overturned. And so they think, well, that's not, we've got where we want on this, so it's not our single issue or our number 1 priority. And as long as Kentucky has a majority of Republican electeds, I don't know that the success is going to be seen in a general election until that demographic switches from Democrat to Republican.
Well, and let's go back to one of those other top priorities. So you talked a little bit about workforce development. So thinking about Northern Kentucky and our economic growth, I wonder if you can talk about some of the legislation this year that spurs or continues to help Northern Kentucky develop in our workforce development. You want to start?
I filed House Bill 34 this session. It's the second year I'd filed it. What the bill is it's universal occupational license reciprocity. And so if you are an optometrist from Ohio and you want to come to Kentucky, there are barriers in place that prevent you from coming in. And so, Ohio has passed universal reciprocity. Virginia's passed it. Tennessee has something quite similar. They have a low barrier. I believe Missouri's passed it as well. So all of our neighbors continue to pass legislation that allows our folks to go over there and start working on day one and these are occupational licenses. These are good paying jobs. These aren't Amazon warehouse workers, no offense to them. But these are folks that have they're plumbers, they're blue collar, they've got an occupational license. And so they're also small business owners. So that's really a great workforce development tool that we could bring in, start to attract folks to Kentucky instead of having folks leave Kentucky. I'm hopeful that we can continue to move the needle forward on that thing as we go forward.
We did a lot of incremental stuff for workforce development this year, but I think the glaring places that we missed are childcare and the housing issue. So we, especially here in Northern Kentucky, I think there's this misconception that people aren't working in Northern Kentucky, and nothing could be further from the truth. We have great workforce participation in Northern Kentucky. The problem is we're out of bodies. We have too many jobs and not enough people to do them, and we're having a really hard time recruiting and retaining people to Kentucky for various reasons. Housing is one, childcare is one. I would argue that some of our social policies are one as well that scare some families and some young families especially away. We are losing, go back to education for a moment, we continue to lose teachers from Northern Kentucky because they can cross the river, go 3 miles away, and make $20,000 more their second year as an educator. So we have got to start combating those foundational issues. We need people to be able to afford to live here, to be able to find an income-aligned house that supports their family. We need them to have good paying, thriving wage jobs, which we are blessed to have an abundance of here in Northern Kentucky. That's not true for the entire state by far, but we are very blessed in that way here in Northern Kentucky. And we need childcare. We absolutely need for families to be able to have their children taken care of, especially so that we can get more women back into the workforce here.
Now, taking that back to the budget and how folks prioritized, or what was prioritized in the budget. So we have a 2-year cycle of budgetary appropriations here in Kentucky. And so what do you think, in terms of Northern Kentucky, were the biggest wins for the budget and maybe the biggest losses?
So I think, so the budget is several parts, right? So I'm going to start with the road plan, because I think the road plan, at least in Campbell County, I think it was for Boone County as well, for the, the 3 counties up here, the road plan is great for us, right? Obviously, we know we're getting the Brent-Spence Bridge, like the second largest infrastructure project in the entire country, and it's coming, and it's going to be amazing, not only for our region, but for the national GDP, right? 4th Street Bridge is something that I have been beating the drum for ever since, before I even got into office. Some of these projects, they get put into the 2-year or the 6-year road plan, and then the can gets kicked down a little bit, and then they become more expensive because of inflation. So one of the big driving things that I did this year was to try and get more money for 4th Street Bridge so that we can build it the right way, so that it is multimodal, so that it really does connect in a beautiful way our 2 communities and the entire riverfront. So where infrastructure is involved, I think it was there are many wins to be pointed out for Northern Kentucky. There are the educational benefits. We did get more SEEK funding. We didn't get 100% funding for transportation, but we got more funding for public school transportation. Those are good things. We got more money for Northern Kentucky University. Those are all good things for our region. Some things that people may not think about just right off the top of their head, but we got more money in for the waiver system. So the waiver system, Medicare waivers, are ways for people who have developmental disabilities to be able to live independently. We have a huge shortage of nursing home facilities and care facilities here, so that's something that's really helpful to our community. The Momnibus bill that came through, which isn't specifically part of the budget but is going to have a good impact and also for economic development, that has a lot of really great parts for women in our community, moms in our community. The HANDS program, which is a really great way for young families to feel supported. So I think there was a lot that was great there. Like I said, it was great to be there. I'm on my way out the door, but it was great to get to be there for a budget that felt a lot more generous and a lot more futuristic than past budgets that I've been there for.
And I would echo that on the infrastructure side as well. When it comes to government funding, there's 3 real essential areas that we've got to look. We've got to look at infrastructure, we've got to look at public education, and we've got to look at law enforcement and our court system. And those are the 3 areas that I think we did well in this budget to address. When you have Senator McDaniel on the Senate A&R chair, Northern Kentucky's going to get its say. And historically, we have not. And so I would give all the credit in the world to Senator McDaniel for making sure that Northern Kentucky got its fair share in this budget and that we were able to get look, when the road projects came out of the House, they weren't that great. And when Senator McDaniel and when the transportation chair, Jimmy Higdon, got a hold of that, they were able to work together to make sure that we move some of those projects in the out years into the current 2-year budget and expand some of those projects. So they did a good job.
Thank you. Audience, and as well as our folks at home, you have the opportunity to ask questions. Just let us know. And Chris has a microphone. Is there a question online? Okay. Well, I'll continue that until I'm otherwise told to. Oh, of course. Yes, sir.
Representative Doan, you just mentioned Senator McDaniel, and he's had a bill for several years to move the gubernatorial elections to the same year as the presidential elections. Why has that never gotten any feet underneath it?
That's a good question. I'm not really sure. The reason behind it is if you're able to move the gubernatorial election to the same year as the general election, you're going to line up with a presidential, and you never have an Andy Beshear again. So from a Republican standpoint, yeah, it makes sense that we would do that. You're going to kind of use that voter base that you know. You're going to also extend whoever's next term out by 1 year. But I'm not sure why. It would be nice for our voters, right? They would have one less year of us out there knocking doors and bothering them.
So I'll play devil's advocate here. I like that we vote 3 out of 4 years. I think it trains up Kentuckians to be civically minded, to be in the habit of voting each and every time. To your point, we do knock on their doors a lot, especially when we have primaries and specials and generals. But you know, as a candidate, we have what's called Vote Builder. You guys call it something else. But basically, when we come knock on someone's door, we have a lot of data about that person's door. Not to sound all big brothery, but I think we all know that this is the world we live in, right? So we know whether you vote regularly, you know, how reliable a voter you are. And I can't tell you how many times I've knocked on someone's door in an off-year election and said, do you know that there's an election coming up on November 4th or whenever it is? And they say, oh yes, I vote every single time. Well, I can see that you don't vote every single time. But it's not that they're lying to me, it's that they think they do because they vote in a presidential election, and that's, you know, the public zeitgeist, that's the election. And so I think the more opportunities people have to vote, the more civically engaged they become. So I see it as a good thing. I could make an argument because of the cost benefit of consolidating it, but I don't think it's a bad thing for us to be in the habit of voting regularly.
Similarly, just as a political science professor kind of perspective, not allowing independents to participate in the primary is also a challenge. But
yeah,
it's always an interesting thing on the Republican side is that we're the party that defends the Constitution, but we're also the party that always wants to change it.
Except that you guys always put forward unconstitutional bills. It's so confusing.
Well, when we were last chatting, you mentioned law enforcement. And so you sit on the Judiciary Committee, correct? Okay.
Correct.
And one of the bills that was on the agenda this year was the Safer Kentucky Act.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of that bill and the success or not success after leaving the House.
Yeah, so the Safer Kentucky Act, I'm one of 3 Republicans that voted no on that bill. And I voted no on that bill because, I serve as a board member on a homeless shelter. I saw a lot of those policies that were coming through on that bill as negative, that would actually hurt folks that are trying to find housing. I also saw some of it as a big overreach for government. What we did is we took away judicial discretion on a certain amount of issues. Look, in Louisville, where you have, and I hate to get partisan, radical liberal judges that just let anybody out and walk the streets who just committed a crime, that's a problem, but that's a Louisville problem. It's not a Northern Kentucky problem. We have good judges here. We have judges that look at the crimes that are charged against people and set appropriate bond, or they don't let them out, or they sentence them appropriately. So what we did is we took discretion away from our good judges here and forced them to go into jail longer, force these convicted folks to go into jail longer. There was Section 20 of that bill. I found it to be the most egregious piece of legislation that we passed all session. Essentially what Section 20 does is if a local municipality, police, law enforcement agency, whatever local government entity doesn't strictly enforce the camping provisions of House Bill 5, the Attorney General can now come in and file a civil suit against those agencies. When I served on the city of Erlanger City Council, we hired a social worker to go out and to go work with homeless folks. That policy now under this bill would subject our local government to a civil suit. It's absolutely ridiculous that we would allow something like this to become law. And just as part of the way Frankfurt works, I took that section and I sent it to lobbyists that are paid to defend local government. And they just said, that's a strange thing that got in there. I don't know, maybe we'll fix it over in the Senate. And so what you had behind that bill is you had pressure that Louisville was going to do this for Louisville and Weatherwell. And I say Louisville was going to do this for Louisville. I say the Republican members out of Louisville were going to do this. And there was no denying it. It was an inevitable bill, and so it went through.
I feel like this is the worst piece of legislation by far that we passed this year for many of the reasons that Representative Doan outlaid for you. And we get along, we are friendly towards one another, but we are very different on the political spectrum. So the fact that you have 2 of us who are coming at this from mostly the same place, right? This bill goes too far, it does too much, it is not well thought out. It is, history is the greatest teacher, so we're repeating some of the worst parts of criminal justice history. The outlawing of homelessness is just despicable in my mind. The price tag on this not to pick on your party, but your party is also supposed to be the fiscally responsible one, and we have no idea what this is going to cost. We know that there are 2 provisions in here that will cost billions of dollars to the state over the next 10 years. I think there's 16 different provisions, so this is going to cost billions upon billions upon billions of dollars. What we have learned also from history is that incarcerating people does not fix the problem, right? There are systematic issues here: housing, job availability, childcare, education, all of these things that are the root causes of crime in our communities. This bill does nothing to address any of those. All it does is stiffen penalties. It will incarcerate more people. It will bankrupt our communities because our communities pay for the jails, which will now have so many more people in them. Our jails, which are already overfilled and which we are starving of funds, badly needed funds, to renovate them or expand them, especially if we're going to start putting this many more people in there. So, this bill, not only did I feel that this bill was just so wrong-headed, but it also felt very politically motivated. It feels especially cruel. We are governed by our own rules. This is something I know you and I share in common. Sometimes it's, what we have when we can't stop a bill is we have the rules, we have Mason's manuals, we have the House rules, we have ways to try and to either kill a bill, make a bill better, or get something we want into a bill. This bill was absolutely ripe for what's called a motion to divide, which means it's just too many things packed into one bill, and they're too disparate. They shouldn't be together, right? We shouldn't be attacking the homeless population while also incarcerating to the hilt, right? They're not necessarily they aren't the same issue. So I think this bill would have been perfect for a motion to divide. One was called, it was shot down. But there are parts of this bill that I can get behind. It's not a lot, but there are some parts of this bill that I could probably get behind, but certainly not the whole bill. But to your point, this was on a railroad track that there was no stopping, and it has gone through. So I think the ramifications of this bill will be swiftly and painfully felt by Kentuckians, and I am very sad that there was nothing we could do to stop this.
Well, I believe that if there hasn't already been, there'll be a constitutional challenge. I mean, some of the parts of the bill just don't meet constitutional muster. And so you're going to see that, but it's not going to take all of it out. It's going to take out portions. And I will give some credit to the representatives from Louisville that were pushing and behind this bill. I filed 7 floor amendments on it, and they took up about 5 of them because they realized that we've actually got one of the provisions in the bill would have made it a felony to send a text message, essentially. If you had a domestic violence victim, it's a crime to text message that domestic violence victim. But sometimes, having practiced in this area, you'll have someone who's sending pictures of your kid to you and saying, Johnny wants to talk to you, Johnny wants to talk to you, and they're baiting you into it. And so what you created was a situation where potentially somebody could be baited into a felony. The punishment just doesn't fit the crime on that. We already have processes in place to take care of that if that does happen. And so they did take that up. We were able to get that fixed in the bill. But there were plenty of those areas where you just didn't have enough time to get in, to actually dig in to understand the bill. The bill was announced in December. It was filed. It probably wasn't filed until February.
Yeah, it was filed later. We didn't have a lot of time to look at it before.
And I had asked for probably, and me being in the majority, you would think that, and on judiciary, you'd think I would get an advanced copy, and I continued to ask for one. And so it was just one of those, it was already decided, this is what we're going to do, and too bad if you don't like it.
I often make the comment to my students that, laws are like sausage. You don't necessarily want to see all of them being made, and this seems like an opportunity where some of that, fits a little bit. So thinking a little bit about your career, Representative Roberts, I know this is our last few months of your service. So one of the items you focused a lot on is medical marijuana. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the work you've done on that and the successes or not successes in the legislature for Northern Kentucky.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest success is that we have, we do have a medical marijuana program, cannabis program in the state now, which is great. It was under attack twice on the floor this year. The Senate actually tried to completely cut the legs out from under the program in the budget. I was happy to be in on the budget free conference committee, and myself and Representative Nemes, who is another one that, generally speaking, we're going to be on the complete opposite sides of things. But when it comes to medical cannabis, we both care deeply about that. So we were able to, get them to take that part out and keep the program alive. But regardless, what we will have in Kentucky is the most restrictive medical cannabis program in the entire country. And my hope when I'm gone is that there will be others who will take up this champion call and make sure that patients of Kentucky have access to the medicine that they are asking for. So I'm very grateful there. I have put forward a bill for every year that I've been in the legislature to expand this to full adult use cannabis. And part of the reason for that is, from a purely economic standpoint, medical cannabis is the worst thing we could do for the state. We got to pay for the oversight of it. We've got to put programs in place, but we don't generate any money because we don't tax medicine in the state. We are uniquely poised in Kentucky to be exceptional at cannabis. We have a history of being exceptional at cannabis. Make no mistake, cannabis is being grown in Kentucky, it is being sold in Kentucky, it is being consumed in Kentucky. It is just not being regulated for constituent safety, and it's not being taxed for the greater good of the state. So it is my hope that we will continue to move forward. It's encouraging what the Biden administration may be doing here in the next few days as far as reclassifying it. But as all the states around us have more robust medical programs and adult use programs, we continue to be late to the table here. And there's real financial gain for the state in this. And there will be people who will say, well, it's not worth it because of all of the pitfalls of it. Well, again, make no mistake, it's already being utilized here. We're experiencing all the pitfalls. It's very much like the argument for sports wagering in the state, right? We have all the negative aspects of it. We just don't have any of the benefit for the populace in it, or any of the ability to be able to use, in the case of sports wagering, some of those funds to deal with problem gambling. The bill I put forward every year sets aside a certain amount of the income generated for treatment programs throughout the state, and for minority and small business education grants and so on and so forth. So I hope that it will continue on. Maybe it's something you're interested in. This year it was House Bill 420. We were just talking about that. That was very purposeful. It took me 4 years to get that House bill, but that House bill number. But there are bills we certainly put forward that we know are not going to move and become law that year, but we know that we have the opportunity to elevate the conversation around it. So part of that bill number was to elevate the conversation around it and just to keep that conversation going, because there are very few issues left that are truly bipartisan and that are truly, truly popular. And cannabis is one of them. It may be the only one left in Kentucky.
Depends on what part of Kentucky. No. Sorry. But I think, look, medicinal marijuana, I mean, if it's medicine, it's medicine. Let's find some alternative treatment measures. Let's get it through and regulate it. It was really strange to me that the Senate wanted to remove all funding. Yeah. What I'm told, when I first come into office, I'm told the most important thing is electing a Republican governor. We got to get rid of Andy Beshear. The most important thing is electing a Republican governor. So our Republican leadership gave Andy Beshear a huge win on medical marijuana. We passed it, but he went around the state and said, look what I got you, look what I did. And then we come back the next year after we lose the election and gut the program that we just gave him a major win on. It's like, what are we doing in Frankfurt sometimes? The right hand's not talking to the left hand, and that's within our own caucus. And so, it's good that we have medical marijuana. Anything that we can do to get away from, look, I don't take any drug. I mean, I take Advil, and that's about it. That's the extent of anything. And so I'm not for drugs. All drugs are bad. There are some negative side effects of them. Sometimes the positive benefits outweigh the negative. And so with medical marijuana, we've got to make sure that we're highlighting those positive benefits and we're avoiding the negative benefits. Among young men, schizophrenia goes through the roof. You're seeing this in Colorado. And so we've got to, while medical is good, we do need to watch as we go into rec. It's already here. I know that as a family law attorney, you'll see somebody come in and they'll say, he's smoking marijuana or she's smoking marijuana, and they want the judge to go drug test them because they're trying to take the kids away as a bargaining chip later for something else. And a lot of our judges have ignored that and just said, look, we understand marijuana's here, whether it's medicinal or whether it's recreational. But we've got to tailor our policies as we go forward to make sure that we're actually doing this for a medical reason and not for a full-blown recreational reason, without truly educating and having our population understand that there are negative side effects to that.
I guess he's not going to carry it going forward, unfortunately. Find someone else.
Yes.
I kind of have two questions. So Representative Roberts is one of those, and others at the state level and at the national level are dropping out. They're decided not to continue as legislators, and you have two that are in pretty significant Senate positions, and they're dropped out. How is this going to affect the legislature's operations coming up?
So I'll say one of the reasons people are dropping out, especially at the level that we serve at, is the job is a part-time job, which we all sort of joke about, because it's not a part-time job to do it properly. And the public perception is certainly not that it's a part-time job. The public expects that we are full-time legislators and that we are always out there working. But the job pays like a part-time job. It pays like a very good paying part-time job, but it's still, generally speaking, not enough to support a family on. And for those of us who live, an hour and a half, 2 hours away, there's a lot of time commitment to getting down to Frankfurt and doing the job. We're away from our families the first quarter of every year at least. And then depending on how robust your interim schedule is, it can be another 8 or 10 days a month that you're away. And all of this adds up. It makes it really hard for young families. I applaud you for being able to do it. But it also makes it a very self-selecting body, right? We are a very white body. We are a very affluent body. We are very narrow in life experience as far as career paths go, right? We have attorneys, we have realtors, we have pharmacists. To my knowledge, the only people who serve or who are members of a union, Tina Bojanowski, who's a teacher out of Louisville. We have one nurse who's in there. So it becomes a very self-selecting group. And it means that it's harder and harder for normal, everyday people to hold these jobs. And so Senator Thayer, yet another person I don't agree with very much, but nonetheless on this issue I absolutely do, put forward a bill to change legislator pay. I believe the base pay was going to be something like $65,000 a year. And I honestly think that we need to consider that. And I know that that is not going to be popular. Like, people love to say, we're not paying politicians, or we're not paying them more. Well, you get what you pay for. And if you want people to be able to do this job and be truly dedicated to this job and not be swayed by the outside influences so much, then this job needs to pay a wage that you can support your family on and that you can just make work. That's not the whole reason that I'm leaving by any stretch of the imagination, but it is very much so my intention to leave the General Assembly in some way better than I found it. And I think that conversation truly needs to be had so that more people have the opportunity to run for office from a wider variety of backgrounds, so that the body starts to become more reflective of the community in whole. We were talking about before we came on air here that we've lost so much of the institutional knowledge. So last year, I think 83 of the 100 members had been there for 6 years or less. This is a really complicated job. And so here at year 5, I feel like this year I truly was like, oh, I'm kind of good at this now. But it took me 5 years to get to the point where I was like, didn't have full-time imposter syndrome and knew what I was doing and knew the right questions to ask and was brave enough in every room to ask the question because I had enough background to feel like I was asking an intelligent, helpful question. So if we keep cycling people out because the environment is so toxic and caustic, because the elections are so toxic and caustic, because the elections cost so much money, you got to raise at least $100,000 to win a $24,000 a year job. I mean, and this is the capital W-E. All of us have contributed to this. We have created this environment where we no longer allow our elected officials to be fallible humans. We expect them to be perfect and to believe exactly what we believe on every single issue. And we were also chatting about this beforehand. I don't even believe, as an individual person, in every vote I take, because I don't believe it's my job to vote for Rachel Roberts. I believe it's my job to vote for the 45,000 people I represent. And sometimes they think a different way on an issue than I do, and it's my job to be their voice there. So we've got to give more grace to the people who run. We've got to change the platform so that more people can afford to run. And then we've got to, just buoy more people to say, you can do this. I think especially young people think, oh, I'm not qualified enough for this, I have to be an attorney to do this, whatever. I'm a freaking yoga teacher, and I was able to do this and do it relatively well, I think, for my community. So as long as your heart is the heart of a servant, then you are qualified to do this job, and I would encourage you to consider it. And I hope that the environment changes to make it more palatable to make it easier and better for more people to be able to do it.
Yeah. Look, politics is a nasty game. Before our form of government came about, we decided these political issues through war. And what our founding fathers did is they got rid of a system of bloody conflict and turned it into a democratic process where you go out and elect people. Unfortunately, that requires our citizens to participate. In my election, my first election, I won by 120 votes. I took 54% of the vote. Those two things don't seem to align, that I would win by such a large margin, but have only won by 120 votes. Ultimately, that comes down to 0.03% of the population picked me over my primary opponent. In that election, there was well over $500,000 spent on one side. I raised almost $50,000, and I had a couple outside groups come in and help me. My opponent, who was well funded by a lot of Frankfurt special interest groups, well over $500,000. He alone raised $200,000 in his race. And so it takes a lot of money. It's nasty. When you go door to door and you're out, you just want to talk to voters, you want to express who you are, you want to get out what you're doing, and then all of a sudden you get a text message on your phone and you look at it and it's a picture of you, and it's our video of you, and it's saying you're just lying to get attention and trying to use your position here for your own personal gain. It's a tough thing to experience, and then to know that you're on somebody's porch and they're coming to the door and you both have just gotten the same text message, and now I've got to put that behind me and make sure that I can talk to them. So it takes a lot personally and just emotionally to engage in the process. And then once you get in there, this legislative session, we spent $9.7 million, we didn't, the lobbyists spent $9.7 million trying to influence the way that we vote. It's a record, and it's up another $500,000 from the prior session before. In 3 months, that much money was spent. And so there's a lot of pressure, and there's a lot of folks that see their opportunity to influence the rest of the state, while the rest of the state really isn't paying attention. And so what we need to do better as politicians is to go out and to reach people and to encourage folks to get out, to vote, to participate in the system. Because when you have such a divide that we have in Frankfurt, it's easy for a lot of people's voices to be lost, and for them to just never think that they can have a say. But when you really look at it and you can see that powerful committee chairman can go down by 120 votes, that's one weekend that somebody can do, or can knock doors. 120 votes, you can swing that in a weekend. And so, until we actually get back to representing people instead of special interests, I think you're just going to continue to see this division. And that's the problem.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
I'll also say we have a unique problem here in Northern Kentucky, which is we have a donut hole of media coverage, right? Mm-hmm. We are the redheaded stepchild of both Cincinnati and Kentucky. Mm-hmm. So people here just aren't exposed to what their state government does. I'm sure you get it all the time too, but people think I'm their congressperson, right? Or they think that they should call me for the pothole on their city street, right? Mm-hmm. People don't understand the different layers of government, and so I think a big part of this job, at least the way I've held the job, is to try and educate people on how important and how truly impactful state government is to their daily life, so they can engage a little better with government.
Yes.
Thanks. As a Northern Kentuckian, one of my biggest concerns is access to health care. I appreciate that you have talked about abortion already. But in more general terms, I'm very concerned about the St. Elizabeth monopoly that we have in Northern Kentucky. I don't feel that I can find the right provider. And I think one of the issues related to that is certificate of need, which I know did come up a little bit in this session. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that issue of certificate of need and how we might see maybe that change going forward?
So I filed a floor amendment on I believe it was 203. I believe that was the certificate of needs bill. There were 3 of them, but that was one of them. And it was just a 2-word amendment or 3-word amendment that CON is no more, basically, is what it said. We're going to repeal all of it. So I'm for a full repeal of CON. I don't understand how any Republican who says that they stand on free market principles would allow, and we approach this from completely different philosophies, I would assume. I don't know where you stand on the issue, but the Republican would stand on free market principles and philosophies and think that we need government to tell us whether we can or can't open a hospital in our community. And so, look, I'm for a complete repeal of CON. I was at a candidate forum the other night, and somebody was running for office, and they said, you know, if you want healthcare choice, if you want choice, we have it. It's called a bridge and a car. And it was one of the most just disappointing things to hear somebody say that, because not everybody has a car, and sometimes that bridge gets shut down, or sometimes you might want to make that choice there in the moment, but you can't get to Christ Hospital. And so we need to look at that issue. We need to move it. And I know that there's a lot of, we talked about money being spent in politics and in elections. There is a lot of money coming into these Republican primaries to influence folks into electing candidates that are going to allow monopolies to continue. I'm just not for that.
So it's a really complicated issue because while I totally understand what you're saying here in Northern Kentucky, it's very different in rural parts of the state where CON is the only thing, or at least we will be told that it's the only thing that's keeping hospital providers in those areas. There was a task force this last summer, and one of the ideas that came out of that I think is really intriguing is that, you know, we sort of set CON aside when there is a true need in the community. For instance, we don't have pediatric care in Northern Kentucky, right? We don't have an inpatient eating recovery center in the entire state of Kentucky, for instance. So there may be places here where we can carve out so that the specific needs of each community can be better filled without the detriment that we hear is coming, right? So the argument that the St. Elizabeths of the world will say is that we have to take everybody, and so if you're going to allow other players to come in and challenge our monopoly, which effectively they do have here, then maybe you even the playing field by saying, you know, if Christ Hospital is coming here, they have to take the same number of Medicare and Medicaid patients per capita or per, you know, percentage-wise as St. Elizabeth does. So there are solutions to this problem that may not involve an entire repeal of CON if indeed repealing CON truly would hurt the rural communities in the ways that we've all been told they would be harmed.
And when we talk about rural communities, what's the hospital south of St. E's and Florence? I mean, and it's not out of ignorance that I don't know. It's that I don't believe that there is a hospital in Owen County. So if you have a significant medical emergency in Owen County, you're being transported somewhere else. That's a rural area where CON has failed. When you look at the history of certificate of need laws, the federal government in about 1967, I believe, instituted these laws and said, all right, each state, you're now going to go out and you're going to develop a CON law specifically to address rural health care because it's not here and it's not happening. And so all the states went out and passed this, and the federal government looked at it and said, we've completely failed, we've completely messed this legislation up, we're going to repeal it. And so I believe in the 1980s our federal government repealed it, but yet our states still have these policies on the books. I don't think any policy that's been around since the 1960s or 1980s should still be on the books unamended and unaltered. So we certainly need to update these issues and to look at them. Because if you think that our government got it right then for something that we're doing 50 years later, I can't imagine that that law is still working the way it was supposed to.
But the Constitution needs no vetting?
That's the framework. That's the framework by which the system works.
Sorry.
It's the framework.
My coffee just kicked in.
Not
Sorry.
the policy.
Well, we have just a few minutes left, and I wanted to end with a question about the next election. So we are in the middle of a primary season. Kentucky's primary is in, you probably know this more than I do, 9 days-ish?
It's the 14 days.
14
the
days.
21st.
Sorry, I just made my own election day. What can I say? An independent voter can vote anyway. Anyways.
Early voting will open around then, so
there you go. So I wonder if you have any predictions for the fall, coming out of primary season, what's going to look like in the fall, Kentucky's election, the presidential election. I appreciate that's beyond your pay grade, but still predictions for the future.
In terms of Kentucky, I mean, I think that you're going to see a Trump win here. What'll be interesting on a national level is what RFK, the impact RFK plays in it. Mm-hmm. If you actually have a legitimate third-party challenger, what impact that has, both on, because he's going to steal from Trump and he's going to steal from Biden, and I think that's going to be really interesting. But I think that within Kentucky, I mean, you're just going to continue to see that red domination that you've seen in the past.
I think there'll be a couple Democratic pickups at the state level. Not a ton. I'm not Pollyannish about it. There'll be 2 or 3. But that will be the beginning of the turn, right? So I think we'll start to see some more pickups in 4 years and 6 years and 8 years. And that is good. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a Democrat and I want more Democrats in office. Government works best when there's a healthy amount of friction. And when you have a hypermajority either way, then there's not that healthy friction. And that's when we start getting these crazy shiny penny bills that go through that have those unforeseen consequences. And when that really good work of government, which is the minutia in the middle ground of that sandbox, that work doesn't happen, right? So I think it's a good thing. I think it's time. We are so out of balance that it's time for us to start moving back. And I think Kentuckians are starting to see that, but it will be slow. I think the primaries are becoming really, really interesting. And to Representative Doan's point, so few people vote in primaries that your vote truly does have an outsized weight when you vote in a primary. When I won in the special election, I haven't had a primary, but special election, I think there were only like 7,000 total voters, which is a lot, which is a very few number of people making a very big decision for a whole lot of people, right? So I hope that because people are in the habit of voting, because the constitutional officers were just last year, that maybe more people are paying attention. I'm not actually feeling a lot of energy, and maybe it's because I'm not in it, but I'm not feeling a ton of energy in the community for the primary right now. So I'm worried that we'll have low turnout as we usually do. And what happens in the primaries is that the people, because it's so low turnout, the people that come out are the most fervent from both sides. And so then we start to get these big swings, whereas when more people vote, everything becomes more centrist. So it'll be very telling to see how many people actually engage in the primary. I wish I disagreed with you on the presidential election in Kentucky, but it is what it is. We'll have to see what happens more broadly, but the general elections do tend to be at the state level more moderate candidates that win at that level than they are in the primary. So it'll be an interesting year to watch for sure, and we'll see how much the actual makeup of the General Assembly changes.
Well, to jump on that point, when you look at the House, the Democrats had the House for about 95 years, and the highest that they ever got was 80. And where the Republicans currently sit is at 80. Yeah. And there is a big push to pick up that one more for whatever reason. They want to pick up, they just want to get to 81. But what we're doing in the primary is there's a lot of infighting on the Republican side. There have been PACs formed to go after Republican members, and there's strange teams being formed where you have the Louisville Teachers Union, who's, from my opinion, and you can disagree with it, one of the furthest left organizations out there that's now donated some $300,000 to take out Republican incumbents. And so when you have the Republican Party making deals with the Democrats to infight in primaries, you free up the Democrats to sit and fundraise, and maybe some governor's out with a national PAC that's going to try to funnel a bunch of money into state house races, where Andy won, 14? When he won his election, there were 14 state house districts that I think he took 15 or 20% of the total vote in. Mm-hmm. And so what'll be interesting, but what also happened in those races is that the lower ticket ag commissioners through on down won. They all won. All the Republicans won. And so you had a lot of these split tickets. And so it will be interesting to see in this general election whether we do that, whether Kentuckians do that at a state level, whether they Trump's going to win, Trump's going to win big, but whether they don't vote single party and they actually start to pick and choose in those lower state house races, that's going to be the telling point of is the state at a shift, or is it just, hey, we're seeing this stuff on a national level and we're going to keep voting national issues on local issues.
Yeah. I'll just follow that up to say that Kentucky is still one of the only states that has straight party voting, and I implore anyone watching to never tick that box for several reasons. Number one, again, you are hiring each person for each individual job, and you should hire the best person regardless of their party affiliation. And number two, each person who put their name on the ballot is brave. To run for office is an act of bravery, and the least you could do to reward that bravery, even if you vehemently disagree with them, is take the time to fill in a bubble next to them or their opponent's name for each race. So I would love to see that go away. Deeply love to see that go away, again, so that people are more engaged in their civic responsibility and they're really being thoughtful about who they're voting for. And there will be nonpartisan races on your ballot almost everywhere. So if you just take straight party and you don't know to go in and fill those nonpartisan races, you are not casting your vote in those races, and those matter. Those are going to be your judges, your school boards. Those matter deeply too.
Well, thank you for your time today. Thank you for your service, and good luck on the primary. And thank you for joining us at the Northern Kentucky Forum Cafe.